Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This lecture is an introduction to the Golden Age of Athens. So, the 5th century for the Common Era, BCE, a good contextual background for our exploration of the Greek tragedians, Greek comedy of Aristophanes, or the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. So, let's get started. So when looking at Greek history, this is a good way to conceptualize it. We have a very broad timeline here visualized. We have beginning with the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age that begins with the agricultural revolution in Greece. So in that region, it's about 7,000 before the Common Era. So that era going from about 7,000 to 3,000. And then the Bronze Age from around 3000 or 3300 BCE to around 1150. And during that period, towards the end of that period, that's when we get the Mycenaean age. So these Mycenaean palace kingdoms that are the civilization really represented in Homer's epics. And probably at the tail end of that Bronze Age is when the historical Trojan War may have happened. There's archaeological evidence that there was some sort of great city there, a great walled city, and that there was some sort of destruction of that city. And then there's a period that we call the Dark Ages of ancient Greeks, following on the late Bronze Age collapse, which is a Bronze Age collapse that took place in many regions within the Eastern Mediterranean world, leads to the loss of writing, a decline of trade, etc. So we have we have that period of about 400 years, and towards the tail end of that is when actually the Homeric epics were probably composed within the 8th century before the Common Era. So we have the problem of whether or not Homer was writing. Was this an oral composition since writing as an art had been lost during that period? If you want, I've got videos on Homer, an introduction to the Homeric question around that, as well as lectures on both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Then we have the archaic period of ancient Greece, where we have the emergence of the Greek polis, the Greeks, what we call the city state, and the formation of those political entities, and we'll come back to that. And then we have the classical period per se, and this is really the height of Greek culture, Greek political power, Greek cultural expression, philosophy, the arts. And we're going to concentrate on 5th century Athens as the context for many of those works. Then with the fall of the Greek city-states to Macedon, first Philip and then Alexander the Great, we have what's often referred to as the Hellenistic period, covering from the death of Alexander the Great, 323, till roughly the Battle of Actium at 31 BCE. So on that late Bronze Age collapse, returning to that, we can see here in this pink region, this is in the Mycenaean era, we have these kingdoms that had succeeded the era that was dominated by Crete. And it was from this region that these Greek kingdoms sent fleets to Troy depicted up here. But this late Bronze Age collapse, historically speaking, also affected the Hittite Empire, the Canaanites, and it's speculated that perhaps because of this collapse that was brought about by migrating tribes, the Dorians into the Greek area, the Thracians, etc., into these regions, Arameans into this region, perhaps that allowed the Hebrew people, the Israelites, to become more substantiated in that Canaanite region. So turning to the rise, excuse me, of the Greek city-state, the Greek polis, we really need to think about the roots of these things in the nature of the family. And I'm referring in the next couple slides to a great work of scholarship on this, the ancient city, on the religion, the institutions of Greece and Rome by Coulanges. And the ancient family forms the root of this, and it's the paterfamilias for the Romans. So it's not thought of as a private sphere. So we often think of the family, the home, as the private sphere as opposed to the public sphere. That was not the case. Rather, the family is the locus of one's civic and religious identity. So it's it's the core of the worship of the ancestors, the family fire, the hearth. So without these, one does not have an identity. This is encapsulated well in Virgil's Aeneid. So at the end of book 2, he's describing the fall of Troy. He's recounting these events, and Troy is falling, and he has to get his family out of Troy. He carries his father Anchises on his shoulder, and representing carrying the burden of the past, the traditions of the family, and his father is carrying the household gods, the penates, these figures of the gods that were worshipped in the home, and he's leading his young son Ascanius by the hand. So he's carries the burden of the past, but he's also leading the future. And this is a quote from book 2 of the Aeneid. With that over my broad shoulders and round my neck I spread a tawny lion's skin for a cloak, and bowing down I lift my burden up. Little Iulus, that's another name for Ascanius, his son, clutching my right hand, keeps pace with tripping steps. My wife trails on behind, and so we make our way along the pitch-dark paths, and I, who had never flinched at the hurtling spears or swarming Greek assaults, now every stir of wind, every whisper of sound alarms me, anxious both for the child beside me and burden on my back. So the extended families begin to form larger units, clans and tribes under the worship of a common ancestor. And this happens over a long period of time. And these ancestors are given legendary semi-divine status. They have heroic status, and this forms the basis of a lot of their cult worship. The incorporation of a set of tribes and a clans begins to develop into a city. So that's the next step in the development that happens in that archaic age that I mentioned. So under the common worship of a god or a goddess, with larger scale of association, the gods of nature would be more easily shared than a common ancestor. However, ancestor worship and the importance of keeping the family hearth continued. So this ancient city is really rooted in these religious foundations. So kingship is the highest priesthood, and then later when monarchy gives way to republics, the chief magistrate remains the high priest. So it's really a civic religion. So religion is not separated from state. There's not a separation of religion and state. The religion is really the foundation of the community. And attachment to the city is not just to a collection of houses, it's to the burial ground of the ancestors and to the common territory of that sacred site. So that's what they're defending. They're defending a sacred site. It's not just, as I said, a collection of buildings that if we lose that, maybe we build somewhere else. So when founding a colony, the Greeks brought some of their ancestors' ashes to consecrate the new site. And when defending the site of the city, there's a great fervor for the ancient citizen. Their whole identity and meaning are at stake. So some of the factors that went into the rise of this polis, this city-state as a political, religious, cultural unit, almost uniquely in the Greek and Roman world, especially in Greece here, is the decline of the Mycenaean civilization. So those palace kingdoms left a bit of a power vacuum. There's population growth following the Dark Ages, hoplite warfare, so heavily armored citizen soldiers, these hoplites that promoted civic responsibility and participation, so integrating the citizenry into the political life. They have a they begin to have a shared culture of these city states with the development or the reintroduction of writing. Agricultural advancements, improved farming techniques with cultivation of crops led to larger populations and the ability to be self-sufficient. Trade and craftsmanship, so the growth of these different crafts and the production of different equipment allowed for more complex trade and more complex political institutions as a result. Introduction of coinage that facilitated that trade. Also unique to, let's say, Greece as opposed to some of these other regions, the fragmented geography kind of facilitates that type of fragmentation of political communities. You can have these isolated and self-sufficient regions of a city surrounded by farmland. So this polis, as I've mentioned, it's where we get the term politics, of course, and many of the early uh, polis structures were oligarchies, so which is a rule of the few, which from a group of powerful, wealthy landowners and noble families. And later on, Aristotle, as he only Aristotle can do, is able to summarize this in a very succinct way of the possible forms of government. So you can have rule of the one, the few, or the many, and it can be true, which looks to the good of the whole, or perverted, looks to the good of one part, the part that is ruling. So the rule of the one can be a monarchy if it's a true government that looks for the good of the whole. So even though it's a monarchy, it's a wise monarch that ensures that the entire community is prospering. The perverted form of that, of course, is tyranny, where the sole ruler only looks to the good of the tyrant. And then similarly with the rule of the few, its true form is aristocracy, the rule of a few of the best citizens. That's where we get that term aristocracy is the aristeia, is the rule of the best. And the perverted form is the rule of the few in the sense of those who are looking out for themselves. So the oligarchy might be just looking out for a few rich citizens. And then with the rule of the many, Aristotle calls it a constitutional polity or a mixed regime. And the perverted form would be democracy, later on called ochlocracy, so where it's kind of a mob rule. They're just looking out for kind of advancement of the poor or the disenfranchised. They're not trying to better the whole community. So at the end of the sixth century BCE, we have the overthrow of the Pisistratid tyranny in Athens, which ushered in a set of reforms that ultimately led to Athenian democracy, which was the form of government in Athens during that classical, that kind of apex of Athenian culture in the 5th century. So Cleisthenes is credited with these reforms after the overthrow of Pisistratus and his sons Hipparchus and Hippias. Cleisthenes, with the support of the middle class and aided by Democrats, takes over in 507 before the Common Era. So among other things, what Cleisthenes does is he breaks up the power of the nobility by organizing citizens into 10 groups based on where they lived rather than where their wealth. And he calls these reforms, let's say the goal of these reforms is isonomia. So meaning equality with respect to the law. So iso meaning equality, nomos meaning law. So it's not democracy in our sense, and it's not, let's say, aimed at the rule of the people or the many. It's aimed at ensuring equality before the law. Now, notably, in the 20th century, Friedrich Hayek, a great thinker and economist, wanted to revive the word isonomia because he believed it better captured the classical liberal idea of equality before the law, more so than modern concepts of equality. So the classical isonomia emphasized impersonal, universal rules rather than politically determined outcomes. So for Hayek, attempts to achieve social justice or equality of outcome, what we sometimes today call equity, these require the state to make specific discretionary decisions that favor some people at the expense of others, and it politicizes resource allocation. And this drive for social equality puts everyone under the coercive power of a centralized authority. So this is different from notions of liberty and notions of equality that we would see in the classical era. And this, one of the works that he works through this idea would be The Road to Serfdom. So early on in the 5th century, as we mentioned, Athens establishes a set of institutions leading to its democratic form of government, or its equality before the law. And early in the 5th century, this democratic regime, along with other Greek allies, had to face a massive invasion from, or two sets of invasions from the Persian Empire to the east. So in the first wave, there's the decisive Battle of Marathon that is very famous. And then in the second wave, Thermopylae and Salome. And having defeated the Persians, it leads to the ascendancy of an Athenian empire, the Delian League. So here's a map of this territory and the map of roughly the roots of these Persian invasions. So the first one, we see the first highlighted battle here is the Battle of Marathon in 490, which is a decisive defeat of the Persians by the Greeks, led by the Athenians. And in the second invasion, so the first invasion is led by Darius, the ruler of the Persians, and then 10 years later we have Xerxes lead an even more massive invasion, a land force that takes this route, as well as a large naval force with expeditionary troops attached to it that take this route along the coast. The land force, famously in this second battle that's highlighted, the Battle of Thermopylae, met the Spartans, representing it in that film relatively recently called 300, highly stylized film of the Spartans holding off the Persians and dying down to the last man, but delaying them sufficiently so they were not able to take over Greece as quickly, and the other cities were able to prepare. The naval force at the same time managed to sack and burn Athens. So Athens' entire citizenry needed to flee. They then conducted a decisive naval battle, the Battle of Salome, right here, number 4, which is just one of the most important battles in the history of the West. And finally, the Battle of Plataea, the combined Greek force defeated the Persians, and that was the end of that particular set of invasions. So following these Persian wars, Athens and its Delian League that we'll see was in the ascendancy both politically, economically, and culturally. They have this immense cultural explosion, and often referred to as the Periclean age. So Pericles is this great leader of the Athenian people during this time, beginning in 469 until the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, 431. And Athens becomes this military economic empire. Parthenon is built, it's finished in 432 BCE. So it's able to have these huge construction projects because they're amassing huge wealth from this, basically an empire that they're extracting wealth from their quote unquote allies, but these allies need to pay them tribute and or furnish ships for the Delian League Navy. Herodotus in this period invents history. We also have flourishing of philosophical inquiry that it had begun in the 6th century, but we really have the apex to some extent of it, and really coming into its fruition in the early 4th century with Plato and Aristotle, of course. We have advancements in the study of nature and mathematics, and I'll refer you to my video on the quarrel of philosophy and poetry of some of the tensions that arose with that rise of philosophy in the 5th century. We also have the birth of and the prospering of Athenian theater. The first recorded dramas were in the late 6th century BCE, but really flourished again in the 5th century BCE with Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, in comedy, Aristophanes. I also have a video on an introduction to Greek tragedy. If you'd like to check that out. Something to note too about these institutions. So we have an assembly in this democratic Athens where all the citizens, the male citizens, can gather together to discuss their pressing political, social, economic issues of the day. And theater as well. The citizen body are getting together to assess speeches, competing speeches, and evaluate the best course of action or which is best. And so too in law courts. All three involve the citizen body coming together and collectively judging competing speeches, so to speak. So whether it's the political assembly, maybe there's two speeches on the best course of action. We get good representations of this in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which we'll talk about next, as well in the theater, again, these competing speeches. The law courts, well, we have the competing speeches represented in the Apology of Socrates by Plato, as well as Xenophon's Apology. So the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides, as I mentioned, his great history is the best work on this. Xenophon also has a work called Hellenica, which picks up where Thucydides trails off. So this takes place from 431 to 404 BCE. Alcibiades is a kind of an important figure here, especially in the second half of this extended conflict. And he becomes emblematic of the potential dangers of unleashing individual genius unattached to one's civic community. So is this maybe part of the reflection? I think if you read Thucydides, especially Leo Strauss's essays on Thucydides, is this, let's say, the difference between Alcibiades and Nicias, or Alcibiades as this representative of new learning, of individual genius, unattached, as I said, to civic community, unattached to ancient traditions, and Nicias and some other figures representing maybe another pole of that. With the defeat of Athens and at the end of these wars, we have a decline of Athens as a power. Here, turning back to our map, this is in the blue region, following, as I said, the Persian Wars. Athens develops this network of allies that are really subjugated by Athens as the major power, and this Delian League or this Athenian Empire ends up combating this red region of Sparta and its allies. One of its important allies is in this isthmus, Corinth, for instance. So the fall of Athens leads to accusations that the new learning, so philosophy is, well, inquiry into nature, as well as we'll see, sophistry, is what contributed to the loss of the Athenian virtues, the virtues that had led to the victory over the Persians at Marathon. So this is in some ways a theme you see in Aeschylus. Are we losing the virtues that we had, the kind of the martial virtue, the attachment to the community, the what would later be called Stoic virtues of being able to withstand hardships and being committed to self-sacrifice in the name of something larger than oneself. Are we losing that because we're turning to newfangled ideas, so to speak? And this is kind of a perennial debate in many societies where people are saying, "Oh, it's not like the good old days," but Athens really confronted that, especially with their defeat in the Peloponnesian War. So the Sophists are one example of what could be seen as, for these Athenians, a new practice, a newfangled practice that was introduced that corroded a belief in the old gods, the old ways, and ancient virtue. So they're paid teachers, these sophists, and increasingly needed in democratic Athens because rhetoric is a highly sought after skill. I remember I mentioned that in so many of these arenas, it comes down to we have competing speeches and we have to evaluate it. So the sophist teaches this skill that okay, well, you need to be convincing in the law court, or you need to be convincing in the assembly. So I can teach you how to win an argument. And they part of the sophistic approach is this distinction between nature and convention, and that would take us too far afield to go into that in too much depth, but it begins to raise questions that become fundamental to political philosophy. But they also bragged that they could make the inferior argument defeat the stronger, and which raises the specter of relativism, is what we would call it today, and not necessarily named that at the time, but thoughtful people recognized it for what it is. It's not being grounded in truth. So the sophists and the first philosophers were seen as corrosive to the communal glue that held the society together, and Socrates becomes associated with these thinkers. So Socrates is tried and executed in 399 BCE. And like the first philosophers, the early Socrates investigated nature, found that study led to a certain blindness, and this is recounted in Plato's Phaedo. So he turns eventually to the human things. So rather than studying rocks, etc., directly, or the movement of the planets directly, according to this intellectual autobiography that Socrates recounts in the Phaedo, he says, I needed to turn to the human things as articulated in reasoned accounts, logoi. So I had to turn to how people discussed these things, how they arose within our discourse. Now, logos in Greek comes from legein, which is to gather. So logos is a gathering. So logos is translated a discourse or an account, so to speak. It's an account in language. So it's a gathering, the root of that word, legein, gathering. So a way of understanding that is through discourses, humans are able to gather the disparate phenomena of existence and bring them into a meaningful articulation. And this is essential to human identity. That I think that's why if we look at Aristotle's definition of humans as zoon, logon, ekon, often translated as the rational animal, the better way to say it, it would be as the animal able to make accounts, or the animal with language, ability to gather phenomena together and make meaning out of this. So he felt he had to turn from the things themselves because they're confusing. They don't lead to a meaningful arising of the truth of these things, but we can approximate these truths through discourse. Also known for his Socratic ignorance. So Socrates doesn't go around and saying, uh, all matter is X, or gravity is this, or this is the definition of this. He begins by questions. So first of all, he doesn't question on the material things. He says, okay, let's talk about human things. Let's talk about virtues. What is courage? So he goes to the generals and asks, what is courage? And he professes ignorance. This is part of his irony. And he, through his elenchus, his conflictual method, he'll question and probe the answers that he receives from the people of the community. So that can be frustrating, as we all know, if someone's just poking holes in your argument but not offering their own argument in response. This could be one of the reasons why Socrates was tried and eventually executed. Um, he, even though according to his account in the Phaedo, he turned from the natural things to the human things, he needed to defend himself against the charge that he studied things below the earth and in the sky. This is from Plato's Apology of Socrates. So he's tried, executed in 399. This is on the right is a detail from the Death of Socrates by Jacques-Louis David, a famous painting, and just a beautiful portrayal of a scene portrayed in that Phaedo, the last moments of Socrates. He's in his prison cell. He's being offered the hemlock we see in this scene. He's obviously pointing above. He's saying that his soul, or the truths that he's always sought and discoursed about, will endure. It exists in a realm that is beyond this physical, or beyond the existence of his body. And this is part of the point of the Phaedo and the discussion of the soul. So Plato, this is on the right, is the other detail that was blocked off in the last picture of Death of Socrates. Maybe this figure that has his head down is Plato, in distraught that Socrates has chosen to take this hemlock rather than escape. There were possibilities of escape. This possibility is depicted in the Crito, the dialogue previous. So Plato's dialogues could be seen as an extended defense of Socrates and the Socratic way of life, the philosophic way of life, against these charges, showing his readers that what he taught was beneficial for the city. So Plato tells us in his second letter that he shows us Socrates made young and beautiful, that he's accommodated, let us say, Socrates to the community. He's made him, say, attractive for the community. This gets to this questions of Plato's own writings. So I'll put links in the description to, again, this Quarrel of Philosophy and Poetry video that I have, which is part of a set of lectures on esoteric literature. I'll also put in the description a lecture on how to read Platonic dialogue, which goes into some of these issues. So there, a 10,000-foot view of 5th century Athens and some of the important contextual information needed if you're reading Plato, if you're reading Aristotle, if you're reading the Greek tragedians, etc. So I hope you enjoyed that video, and I'll see you at the next one.